The air hung heavy with a chill on the morning of December 5th, 1952. London, with its cobblestone streets and old brick buildings, lay wrapped in a cloak of cold, damp mist. The city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something unseen, something just beyond the horizon. The Thames flowed sluggishly, its surface a mirror of gray skies, as if reflecting the somber mood above. In a small flat nestled on the edge of Battersea, Clara Thompson awoke to the familiar scent of coal smoke. It was a smell she had known all her life, one that whispered stories of warm fires and cozy evenings. Yet today it felt different. The air seemed thicker, more oppressive, as if the city itself was drawing closer, enveloping everything in its path. Clara's world was one of routine and resilience. She lived with her husband, Henry, and their young daughter, Lily. Henry, a bus conductor, had already left for work, his boots echoing down the hallway in the early morning quiet. Lily still slept, cocooned in the warmth of her blankets, her small chest rising and falling in a gentle rhythm. As Clara prepared breakfast, the radio crackled to life, filling the kitchen with the soothing voice of the announcer. There was no talk of smog, no warnings of what was to come, just the usual chatter of weather reports and news from the continent. Outside, the fog began to thicken, curling around the city like a cat settling in for a long nap. Clara watched as the murky haze crept closer. It was an inconvenience more than anything else, a typical London pea souper that would lift by noon. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, peering out the window to glimpse the world beyond her doorstep. The streetlights, usually beacons in the gloom, appeared as faint halos struggling against the encroaching darkness. By the time Lily awoke, rubbing sleep from her eyes, the fog had seeped into every corner of the city. Clara could sense the change as she walked her daughter to school, their footsteps muted by the dense, swirling mist. The usual chatter and laughter of children seemed distant, swallowed by the fog that wrapped itself around them. "Why is it so dark, Mama?" Lily asked, her small hand clutching Clara's tightly. "It's just the fog, darling," Clara replied, forcing a smile. "It'll be gone soon enough." But even as she spoke, Clara felt a twinge of unease. The fog was unlike any she had experienced before. It pressed against her skin, damp and unyielding, carrying with it a strange, acrid scent that clung to the back of her throat. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the fog showed no sign of lifting. Instead, it settled deeper, a silent, suffocating presence that smothered the city's heartbeat. Clara returned home, her mind occupied by thoughts of Henry navigating the city streets in such conditions. She prayed for his safe return, hoping he could find his way through the labyrinth of fog that had become their world. Hours turned into an agonizing wait as evening descended. The radio, now a constant companion, echoed stories of traffic jams and delays, of people stranded and lost in the impenetrable haze. Clara sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the street below, searching for any sign of her husband's familiar silhouette. The fog, it seemed, had a life of its own. It crept into homes and lungs, leaving a trail of coughs and wheezes in its wake. It was as if the city itself was under siege, not from fire or flood, but from the very air its people breathed. By the time Henry returned, his face ghostly in the dim light, Clara's anxiety had reached a fever pitch. He was weary, his clothes carrying the scent of smoke and sweat. His journey home had been a struggle, each step a battle against the fog that refused to yield. "They're saying it's the worst they've seen," Henry murmured, his voice a rasp from the journey. "People are getting sick. The hospitals, they're filling up." Clara listened, her heart heavy with worry. She thought of Lily, tucked safely in bed, oblivious to the chaos surrounding them. She thought of their neighbors, their friends, all caught in the same suffocating embrace of the smog. As night settled in, the Thompsons drew close, huddled together against the encroaching darkness. The fog was a living thing, breathing alongside them, its presence a constant reminder of the fragile line between safety and danger. And as they drifted into a restless sleep, London lay shrouded in silence, its fate suspended in the murky depths of its own creation. As the sun dipped below the horizon on the evening of December 5th, 1952, the world seemed to hold its breath. Carolyn Turner, a young mother living in the heart of London, watched from her narrow window as the sky, once a delicate shade of lavender, began to thicken with an unusual murkiness. The children had just gone to bed, their innocent dreams untroubled by the world outside, a world that was about to change irrevocably. The industrial heart of London pulsed steadily, a testament to human ingenuity and progress. Coal, the lifeblood of industry, burned in every hearth, its smoke rising in plumes to mingle with the cold winter air. Yet beneath this veneer of progress lay vulnerability. The technology of the time, seen as a marvel, was a double-edged sword. Homes were heated by coal fires, factories belched out smoke, and the air was thick with the promise of prosperity. But the cost of this progress was rarely acknowledged. Caroline closed the window, shivering slightly, not just from the cold, but from a feeling she couldn't quite place. Outside, the streets were cloaked in a yellowish haze. It clung to the city like a shroud, thickening with each passing hour. She could hear the distant, muffled sounds of the city, the clatter of horse-drawn carts, the occasional honk of a car horn, sounds that seemed to come from another world, muted and distorted by the fog. By the time the city woke the next morning, the fog had transformed into something more sinister. It was no longer just a curious atmospheric phenomenon, but an oppressive, suffocating blanket that refused to lift. Caroline's husband, Robert, prepared to leave for work, but as he opened the door, he was met with an almost impenetrable wall of yellow-gray. He hesitated, the chill of the fog creeping into the hallway, carrying with it a sharp, acrid scent. Robert turned back to Caroline, his eyes reflecting the unease that was beginning to grip the city. "I can't see more than a few feet ahead," he said, his voice tinged with concern. "It's never been like this before." The children, oblivious to the growing danger, ran to the window, their breath fogging up the glass as they pressed their noses against it. "It's like living in a cloud," young Emily exclaimed, her voice filled with wonder rather than fear. Caroline forced a smile, but her heart was heavy. She knew that something was wrong, something beyond their understanding, beyond the reach of the technology that had become the backbone of their existence. The radio crackled with static, the only source of news in an era before television had become commonplace in every home. Reports of accidents and disruptions trickled in, each one adding to the tapestry of anxiety that was slowly enveloping the city. Hours turned into an agonizing wait. The fog showed no sign of lifting, and the sounds of the city became more desperate. Ambulances struggled through the thick air, their sirens reduced to muffled wails. People wrapped scarves around their faces, their eyes watering as they ventured out into the streets. Carolyn watched from her window, feeling a profound sense of helplessness. She thought of her parents, who lived on the outskirts of the city, and wondered if they were safe. The telephone lines were overwhelmed, and reaching out felt impossible. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of coughing. She turned to see Emily, her little face pale and drawn, struggling to catch her breath. "Emily, sweetheart," Caroline said, rushing to her daughter's side. "Are you all right?" The little girl nodded, but her eyes were watering, and her breaths came in shallow gasps. Caroline wrapped her arms around Emily, holding her close, as if her embrace could shield her from the world outside. As the day wore on, the fog began to seep into every aspect of life, an uninvited guest that refused to leave. Schools closed, transport ground to a standstill, and the city itself seemed to pause, caught in a liminal space between normalcy and chaos. The Turners, like many others, found themselves trapped in their own home, bound by the fog that pressed against their windows, a constant, suffocating presence. Caroline tried to keep the children entertained, reading stories by candlelight, the warm glow a small comfort in the encroaching gloom. Yet even as she read, the words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and uncertain. By evening, the fog had claimed the city entirely. It was as if London itself had vanished, swallowed by the very air it breathed. Caroline looked out once more, her heart aching with the realization that this was no ordinary fog, no fleeting curiosity. It was something darker, a reminder of the era's vulnerability, of the limits of human control. In the distance, a church bell tolled, its sound haunting and melancholic, echoing through the thickened air. The world outside was changing, slipping into a new reality that no one had anticipated. Caroline turned away from the window, clutching Emily's hand a little tighter, her mind filled with questions and fears she couldn't yet voice. As the sun dipped below the horizon on December 6, 1952, the city of London sank deeper into an uneasy twilight. Sarah Thompson, a young mother of two, stood by the window of her small flat in Brixton, peering out into a world that seemed to be fading away. The fog was not just a curtain, it was a wall, impenetrable and unyielding. What once was the familiar sight of the street lamps and bustling roads had been swallowed by a thick, unrelenting darkness. The air was heavy, thick with a sharp, acrid taste that caught at the back of her throat. It was as if the very atmosphere had turned against them, conspiring with the night to smother the city in its oppressive embrace. She tried to close the window, hoping to keep the outside world at bay, but the fog seemed to seep through every crack and crevice, curling into the room like some malignant spirit. Her children, Rose and Thomas, played quietly in the dim light of their small living room, their giggles subdued by the strange feeling that had settled over their home. Even they felt it, the way the air pressed down on their chests, making every breath a conscious effort. Sarah moved to the kitchen, her mind racing with worry about her husband Michael, who had yet to return from his job at the power station. The fog had brought the city to a standstill, and she feared he was trapped somewhere in its murky depths. By the time the city woke the next morning, the fog had grown denser, its tendrils reaching further into every aspect of life. Reports of accidents were rampant. Buses, unable to see the road ahead, collided at intersections, and pedestrians stumbled blindly through the streets, their faces obscured by handkerchiefs and scarves tied tightly around their mouths. At the peak of the disaster, Sarah ventured outside, driven by a need for supplies and news of her husband. The moment she stepped onto the pavement, it was as if she had been plunged into another world, one without color, without sound, without life. The fog was a living entity, swirling around her, its damp fingers probing her clothing, chilling her to the bone. She could barely see a few feet ahead, the looming shapes of buildings nothing more than ghostly outlines. The city was eerily silent, the usual cacophony of life muted by the smog. The only sound was the muffled clatter of footsteps, the occasional cough echoing through the gloom. As Sarah moved cautiously along the street, every step felt like a gamble, the world around her reduced to a monochrome blur. She could feel the grit in the air, tiny particles of soot and smoke lodged in her lungs with every inhalation. Each breath was a struggle, the air itself reluctant to enter her body. People passed her by, shrouded in makeshift masks, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and bewilderment. Some guided themselves with outstretched arms, their fingers brushing lightly against the walls as if to anchor themselves in the tangible world. Others moved in groups, huddled together for comfort and direction, whispering anxiously about loved ones and the chaos unfolding around them. As hours turned into an agonizing wait, Sarah reached the corner shop, relieved to find it open despite the circumstances. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The shopkeeper behind the counter coughing into his sleeve, his eyes red-rimmed and weary. Sarah gathered what she could, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts about her children, about Michael, about what this fog was doing to the city. The shopkeeper handed her the items with a weak smile, his voice barely a whisper as he warned her to be careful on the way back. With supplies in hand, Sarah retraced her steps through the suffocating haze. The fog had grown even thicker, if that were possible, and each step felt like a journey through a nightmare. She clung to the familiar path, using the dim outlines of the street as her guide, her heart pounding with every step into the unknown. Reaching home was a relief, the small flat a sanctuary against the encroaching darkness. Her children ran to her, their faces filled with concern as they asked about their father. Sarah reassured them with a forced smile, her own heart heavy with uncertainty. She knew Michael was capable, resourceful, but the fog was a formidable enemy, one that had already claimed lives and cloaked the city in fear. Settling down for another night, Sarah lit a fire, the flames a comforting flicker against the gloom. But even within these walls, the outside world made its presence known. The smell of smoke and chemicals lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the crisis unfolding beyond their door. As she tucked her children into bed, she whispered stories of brighter days, of sunlight and clear skies, her voice a soft lullaby against the hum of the city. Outside, the fog continued its relentless march. The city of London caught in its grip, waiting for a change in the wind, a shift in the pressure, something, anything, to break the spell and let them breathe again. And in the quiet of the night, as the city lay shrouded in silence, Sarah kept vigil by the window, hoping for the dawn, for a glimpse of her husband through the mist, for the city to find its way back to the light. Mishra, the great smog of London was not just a meteorological phenomenon. It was an omnipresent entity, a living, breathing specter that clung to the skin and invaded the lungs. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the city seemed to fall into an eternal twilight. People huddled in their homes, windows sealed with whatever scraps of cloth could be found, hoping to keep the insidious fog at bay. In a modest flat on the East End, Emily Crawford peered through the slits of her curtains, eyes straining against the sepia-toned world outside. The street lamps struggled to pierce through the murk, casting ghostly shadows on the cobblestones. Her youngest, little Tom, sat at her feet, his wheezing breaths a metronome of unease. His asthma had flared with a vengeance, and every cough felt like a countdown in the oppressive silence. Reports from the time tell of Londoners dropping like flies. Hospitals were overwhelmed, corridors overflowing with patients gasping for a breath of clean air. The death toll mounted with each passing hour, yet the city, in its stoic Britishness, carried on. Buses crept along at a snail's pace, their headlights futile against the wall of gray. Commuters wrapped scarves tightly around their mouths, a feeble attempt to filter the air. Hours turned into an agonizing wait. Emily's husband, Arthur, was due home from work. He was a train engineer, and she knew the smog had brought the railways to a standstill. Yet every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the window set her heart racing in hope. By the time the city woke to another day, the smog had thickened its grip. Daily routines became Herculean tasks. Emily ventured out, the air sharp and acrid in her throat, as she queued at the corner shop for milk and bread. The shopkeeper, Mr. Whitmore, handed her the essentials with a grim nod. He spoke of friends and neighbors, of the unease settling like dust on the city's soul. "Mrs. Crawford," he said, his voice barely rising above a whisper of others that seemed to respect the fog's dominion. "We've not seen anything like this. It's as if the war never ended, and on that if the Blitz came back to haunt us." Emily nodded, clutching the paper bag to her chest. The streets felt narrower, the sky lower, as she trudged back home. The air weighed heavy with the unspoken fears of thousands. As the sun dipped below the horizon once more, the smog crept into every crevice of the city. Emily found Arthur resting in his armchair, having finally navigated the labyrinthine fog. His eyes were bloodshot, the whites turned a sickly yellow from the polluted air. He spoke of trains delayed indefinitely, of passengers stranded on platforms with uncertainty etched into their faces. The long night enveloped London, a blanket of despair that showed no promise of lifting. In Emily's flat, the dim glow of a solitary lamp cast everything in sepia tones, as if they lived in a photograph from a forgotten album. They spoke little, words swallowed by the fog that found its way even through the smallest cracks. Tom's breathing worsened, a rasp that echoed in the silence between them. Every wheeze a reminder of the fragility of life in the face of nature's wrath. Emily sat by his bedside, a damp cloth on his forehead, willing the hours to pass, willing the dawn to bring relief. Outside the city was a tapestry of muffled cries and distant sirens, the sound of life reduced to a muted whisper. Reports filtered in through the radio, a litany of numbers and warnings that felt both distant and deeply personal. "Over 4,000 souls lost," the announcer said, and the weight of those words settled heavily in the room. As the night stretched on, time ceased to have meaning. Minutes bled into hours, defined only by the rise and fall of Tom's shallow breaths. Emily and Arthur shared a glance, a silent pact of endurance forged in the crucible of shared suffering. When the first light of dawn struggled through the fog, it was not the triumphant return of hope, but a weary acknowledgement of survival. The smog lingered still, but in its stubborn persistence, Londoners found a grim determination to endure. The city that had withstood the Blitz now faced a different kind of enemy, one that crept silently, without the fanfare of bombs, yet just as lethal. In the days that followed, the fog would eventually return and leaving in its wake a city forever changed, its people forever marked by the silent specter that had stolen their air. And in the quiet aftermath, as the sun finally broke through the haze, Emily held Tom close, the promise of clear skies and fresh air a balm to their weary souls. As the sun dipped below the horizon on December 9th, 1952, a haunting silence fell over London. The thick, choking smog that had gripped the city for 5 relentless days was finally beginning to dissipate. The air, still heavy with the acrid scent of coal and soot, hung like a ghostly shroud over the city. But beneath this suffocating blanket, a quiet transformation was taking place. The morning after the smog lifted, a pale, tentative sun attempted to break through the lingering haze. The streets, which had been eerily quiet, began to stir with the sounds of cautious footsteps and the hesitant hum of traffic. There was a collective sigh of relief, yet it was underscored by a deep, unshakable fatigue. The citizens of London emerged from their homes, blinking against the weak light, their faces etched with the weight of the past days. For Margaret and her Miley, the morning brought a bittersweet mix of emotions. The oppressive gloom of the smog had seeped into every corner of their small flat, leaving a film of soot on their windowsills and a persistent cough in their chests. As they gathered around the breakfast table, the usual clatter of dishes was subdued, replaced by a quiet reflection on the ordeal they had endured. Margaret looked at her husband, John, who had spent countless hours fighting to keep their home warm and safe. His eyes, usually bright with determination, seemed clouded with a lingering worry. "Do you think it's really over?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John nodded, though his expression remained grave. "For now, maybe. But this city will never be the same." Outside, children ventured into the streets, their laughter a tentative melody in the morning air. The parks, once deserted, were now dotted with figures stretching their legs, seeking the comfort of familiar routines. Yet, the city bore scars. The trees, once vibrant and green, stood ashen and forlorn. Buildings loomed over the streets, their facades streaked with soot. The River Thames, a silent witness to the disaster, flowed on, its waters dark and murky. By the time the city woke to its full bustle, the newspapers were already filled with stories of the devastation. Over 4,000 people had lost their lives, victims of the insidious, unseen enemy. Hospitals were overwhelmed with patients suffering from respiratory ailments, their corridors echoing with the sound of labored breathing. The Great Smog, as it came to be known, had left an indelible mark on the city and its inhabitants. Margaret and John took a long walk through their neighborhood, absorbing the changes that had taken place. The faces they encountered mirrored their own, a mixture of relief, sorrow, and a newfound resolve. Conversations were hushed, but there was a sense of solidarity, a shared understanding that life in London would never be the same. As the days turned into weeks, the city began to breathe again. The government, spurred into action by the tragedy, promised reforms. There were talks of Clean Air Acts and new regulations to prevent another catastrophe. But for many, these promises were little comfort to those who had lost loved ones, or who now lived in fear of the air they breathed. For Margaret and her family, the smog was a reminder of life's fragility. They took to spending their evenings by the fire, sharing stories and holding each other close. The bonds of family, tested and strengthened by the ordeal, became their refuge. John, who had always been the rock of the family, found solace in these quiet moments, his laughter returning, albeit slowly. Yet even as the city healed, the legacy of the smog lingered. It was a specter that haunted the minds of those who had lived through it, a constant reminder of humanity's vulnerability to the forces of nature. The air, though clearer, was forever changed, imbued with a cautionary tale of what could happen when progress outpaced care for the environment. And so life in London went on. The seasons changed, the days grew longer, and the city adapted as it always had. But the memory of that dark week in December would remain, a haunting echo in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. As Margaret stood by her window one quiet evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for her family, for their resilience, and for the chance to see another dawn. She whispered a silent promise to cherish these moments, to never take for granted the simple gift of clean air and clear skies. And somewhere in the distance, the city exhaled, its soul forever marked by the lessons it had learned.